terms of the reception coming, so we appreciate the time that you're spending with us. My colleague, Professor Shawna Kirshner in Political Science Department, far more knowledgeable about international justice issues than I, and so I will defer to you for moderating. You would? We thought it was open.
Awesome. Okay. So I would like to, I'll just start things out with one question, and then we'll turn things over to you guys. You can take it in whatever direction you want. So we have heard a lot today about small questions, right, about sort of what's happened, in the last few months, right, in individual courts, right, and bigger questions. And maybe if we could just start with a really big picture question about whether or not you're feeling optimistic or pessimistic at this moment about where we're at with international law. So.
Well, that's maybe we'll just go right down the road.
I'm not sure she'd be able to comment without getting in trouble.
Well, it's interesting. We're in a business that's 3 steps forward, 2 steps back, 2 steps forward, 3 steps back. But we're always moving forward. Right now, we're in a hiatus where, at the international level, it appears that there isn't a lot of impetus on international justice. Nations are turning inward, or the appearance that nations are turning inward. So these things come in cycles. We have been through a high time, and we're somewhat sliding into a lower plateau. But that doesn't stop us as far as seeking justice for victims of atrocity. And we continue to move forward. I always like to use the example that sometimes the victories are small, sometimes the victories aren't there, but we're still there. The huge, I think, decision back when we all started in this business a couple of decades ago is that the International Committee made the decision to do something. We don't do it all the time, but we decided that we will and can do something when there's a political will to do so. Because it's not really a legal decision to take on those who commit atrocities, particular heads of state or major actors, but it's a political decision by the international community, regional actors, perhaps local actors, to actually decide it's time to do X, Y, or Z. And it has been done. A good example is Charles Taylor. Just not that many years ago, he thought he would never be held accountable for the destruction of over 1 million human beings, and now he's sitting the rest of his life in a maximum security prison in England. So we use that as, I use that as a cornerstone by which, yes, it doesn't seem like we're getting everybody, not everybody's being held accountable, but we chip away because we now have made that decision in the 1990s that we are going to do something when we want to do something. So I'm optimistic. I like Steve Rapp's concept that there's some water in the glass. It is. Yeah, there is water in the glass. I don't know where that water is, but that shouldn't keep us and you from saying, we do have to do something about atrocity, and we're just not going to give up, regardless of how hard it seems or how uninterested many people are about it. We're still going to, keep up the fight.
Yeah, I always ask myself, is the water drinkable? What was left in the glass to begin with?
I've heard it's Chardonnay.
Yeah. I think that it is clear that we are in a difficult moment in time. The 90s were unique in multiple ways. I think I was lucky enough to be involved in negotiations of the Rome Statute, also in other UN initiatives aimed at reducing use of firearms, anti-landmine treaties. So a number of things were basically showing a golden age of multilateralism, a belief in multilateralism as a solution to humanity's problems, a resort to international justice as a mechanism to deal with massive human rights violations. I mean, I think that the use of the Chapter 7 powers by the Security Council to create the ICTY was revolutionary at the time. The first ruling in the ICTY jurisdiction appeal saying what is prohibited for international armed conflict is prohibited for non-international conflict and international custom was revolutionary at the time. When people were even still questioning the customary status of Common Article 3, for instance. So it was a revolutionary period. What happened with these moments of revolution is like you know, the Prague Spring or May of '68 in Paris, and these wonderful moments that at some point finish, and then they're followed by bleaker times. And I think we are in the context of bleaker times. And the problem is not only for international criminal justice, it's a problem for all the values behind international peace, international criminal justice, international legality, rule of law, adherence, universal and unlimited respect for human rights, the idea that basic human dignity, regardless of what you have done, is not something that can be negotiated away or can be tossed away. And you can be thrown to rot in a prison cell in Jordan or wherever you have been kept. So I think that all those things that we thought were quite clear in the 90s started fading away post 9/11, and now I think that we are in a difficult period. I mean, these things come in cycles. I think that Benjamin Ferencz, who's a perennial optimist, will tell you that, we say, well, look, we have that, but at the same time, look at the #MeToo movement. Look at how forceful the demand for respect for women's rights are now. Look how forceful the voice of victims of sexual violence is compared to the way it used to be, not in the 90s itself, when we were starting to really re-engineer the whole approach to sexual violence after years of failing victims of sexual violence, decades of failing victims of sexual violence. So I think that even in this sort of bleaker moment, and let's put it in perspective, we're not back in the 40s, we're not facing a World War II, it's not a war, it's a difficult moment. I think that the importance of strengthening, of maintaining international criminal justice is that basically it is that stubborn, resilient remnant of the good values, right? This is what keeps us, reminds us that basically, you know, you can't ethnically cleanse people, and it can be for food. How we keep it alive? Well, that's an effective, that is a challenge, right? I mean, I am absolutely sure that if today we started a poll in the Assembly of State Parties as how many of our state parties, our constituents, would vote to have the court today, I think that the numbers would certainly drop compared to the votes that we had back in 1990. And I'm sure that a number of our state parties are not at all enthusiastic about what we do. And on top of that, I have to pay for it. So the problem is, every year we have a discussion, they try to keep us in a leash, they don't want us to expand, they want us, it's every year there's a struggle in terms of saying, well, this is not a useless waste of money, this is actually a valuable exercise, and you should be proud to be a part of this, and you should be proud to have been a part of the creation of this mechanism, and other mechanisms as they evolve. So I think I am not pessimistic. I think that this is a phase that hopefully will go away. I think obviously nationalism is on the rise. Hopefully that will change. Relativization of human rights and universal values is also on the rise, but I think that will change. And I have a lot of faith in you guys. I mean, you're the ones that have to fix everything that this generation and my generation has not been able to fix. So I think there's a lot of my optimism goes of what you're going to do with the legacy that we leave behind in perfect assembly. But I do believe that when I see people like you interested in what we do, when I see people like you standing up, shaken by the testimony of a Guantanamo detainee, I think that there's a lot of hope there. So yeah, let's see what you do with it.
In my view, it's really a mixed bag, and it depends on what you're looking at as the mechanism that would take on crimes that are so horrific they offend everyone in the global community, and that's what international crimes are. In terms of a single court created by the Security Council, or even support for a court such as the ICC, I think there is less support for that. I'm not optimistic about that as a solution. However, you know, I spent this last week in New York doing a fundraising trip for the residual special court for Sierra Leone. So I spoke with permanent representatives to the UN from a variety of countries. We had like 23 meetings. And that gives me some optimism in that I was surprised to learn that several of them are talking about the need in the future for hybrid courts to deal with situations the ICC cannot deal with, to deal with situations where perhaps they don't want the ICC to deal with them. So we may have some sort of truly international justice in a hybrid court. We may have other mechanisms that are created. That doesn't have to be a court like the ICC. Doesn't have to be a court like the ad hoc courts. But there are a variety of mechanisms that can be used. And of course, more and more, we need to push for states to assume their responsibility to correct wrongdoings that are either against citizens of their state. And interestingly, even if you're a state party to the ICC, if you have a perpetrator who's a national, then the ICC would have jurisdiction. If the crime is committed in a state party territory, they have jurisdiction. Very interestingly, if you're a state party and your citizen is a victim, that does not confer jurisdiction on the ICC. So there is this concept, though, called universal jurisdiction. And it is that if you're dealing with international crimes that offend all of us, every human being in the world is offended by an international crime, universal jurisdiction says that's an apple up here any state can pluck down, and if a perpetrator, regardless of a connection to a state, goes through your territory, you can take them and you can try that crime. A lot of states are hesitant to use that theory, but it is a valid basis for jurisdiction. And some states are actively embracing it. So that's another way that states can assume their responsibility, because the primary responsibility to protect their citizens and to maintain global law and order is with each individual state, either acting alone or acting collectively. So it could very well be that for a number of years now, it will be up to the states to assume that responsibility. And people such as yourselves and other members in those states can advocate for that. Last night we saw a wonderful film about Guatemala. And it was ultimately the people of that country standing up and saying, you can't do that to us, that led to some reforms in that country. So I think it's a mixed bag. Truly international, one court dealing with it all. Even today we don't have, even with the ICC, because that's limited to states, parties, or Security Council referrals. Other mechanisms, I think there are others we've tried, there are others yet to be created. So there is the possibility of this international approach, but most importantly, let's make states live up to their responsibilities toward their own citizens and toward the global rule of law. And that may be the most effective means of stopping these massive violations of human rights that are occurring all over the globe today.
I'll just add that certainly the second, well, for those of us who have been part of the second wave of development of international criminal law, as Stephen Rapp said this morning, we were not really prepared to the bleak time that we're facing now. We had the impression that this was a movement, it was going in the right direction, the ICC was established, it was going to be able to deal with the most serious crimes, jurisdiction, you know, many states still had to join, but it was a good vibe at the time. And yet you face a situation as terrible as Syria, and yet you see that blockages in your Security Council mean that none of the usual avenues of international criminal justice are yet available. So one could be extremely concerned and sad and desperate. I'm not. I just as Brenda just said, you can see that there are ways for national jurisdiction to make use of the universal jurisdiction. Some do. I mean, for the crimes of Syria, these are our only interlocutors at the moment. And also you have a situation where, okay, we can't refer the case to the ICC. There is no willingness to, or no consensus to create an ad hoc tribunal or regional court to deal with the crime in Syria. Okay, let's not stop. Let's create a mechanism to do the preparatory work that has to be done if justice is to be done, that can support the national prosecutors at the moment and prepare cases for the future. So like most of you, I think I want to be an optimistic person, and I think that will just fill the glass. And yeah, it will probably be your turn then to take up the challenge and to move it forward, but I am optimistic. I think from what we heard today and this terrific panel just before, the victims can't accept that there is no justice. So I don't think we have a choice. We just have to move it forward.
I'd like to footnote just real quickly, also during this very time period of the past 3 years, we also had all of the first tribunals and courts finish their mandates successfully.
Yeah.
First it was Sierra Leone, followed by Yugoslavia, and then Rwanda. So it seems like all of a sudden all the courts disappeared, and rightfully so, because we're done. They had limited jurisdiction on specific areas. They finished their work largely successfully. And so there's an appearance that all of a sudden courts and tribunals are disappearing, and the answer is yes, but it's coming at a time when we're also having a negativity towards the international approach to seeking justice for victims. And so you kind of get that from your point of view and from just the layman's point of view, that all of a sudden this whole idea is disappearing, and it's really not. But we've had this unique situation where the courts finished their mandates all within the 3 years of each other, and then we have these challenges with the nationalistic kind of approach to the world.
And such legacy. I mean,
Sure.
we heard of the, step back and which are clearly not good signs, but I mean, overall, a legacy that we are able to build on now, and that you will be able to build on.
We've sought justice for over 7 million people in the past 25 years.
I mean, I think
That's a win for us, isn't it?
I think, however, I mean, there's one point that is true. I mean, there has been in those who make the calls as to whether a new tribunal is going to be created, a new international mechanism is going to be created, there has been a bit of tribunal fatigue on the one hand. But the problem with that is that the demand for accountability is still there, and at times it's on the rise. So now you have the Yazidi, no one is dealing with that. We don't have jurisdiction. There's no mechanism that has been created. Universal jurisdiction still remains, but there is a decreasing appetite for universal jurisdiction. It's politically complicated. A number of states don't want to do it, or they want to do it. They have limited the requirements for universal jurisdiction to be applicable, so there are few states less capable of doing that. So you have the Yazidis, you have the Rohingya. Let's see whether we can do something with that, but at the same time, when is something else going to be created? You have North Korea. There was a damning report coming from the UN demanding for either a referral to the ICC or the creation of some ad hoc system. In Central African Republic, they have created a special court, what state court is called, starting to do this work. We are supporting the work because we think that this is a great initiative, and we basically want the court to do a number of the cases that we won't be able to do. But so far, we are the only ones supporting the court. They're not receiving the money that they need to receive in order to get the job done. So there is a mismatch now between the demand for accountability and the available resources for accountability, plus the jurisdictional limitations of the ICC.
I think
And that has to change.
I think the optimism, though, is that when we talk about a decreased appetite, we're really talking about what political leaders of states want. But what I have seen, I was at the Yugoslav tribunal when we had one prosecutor also for the Rwanda tribunal, so I dealt with the Rwanda tribunal, and at the Special Court for Sierra Leone, is that we human beings have sort of an inherent need to have accountability for wrongs done to us, accountability in some form. And so I think that inherent need for accountability and a demand for accountability is going to overcome a lot of this political resistance, because in your country, it's going to become politically unwise for your country to continue to resist when you have such a strong civilian push for accountability. So to me, that's the hope for the future, is that people are inherently wanting accountability in some form or the other. And because I say that, I also think that this distinction that is often made between retributive justice and restorative justice is in many ways an artificial distinction, because a critical part of restorative justice is accountability for wrongs done to people. So I think they are part of the same solution They're not distinct approaches, but rather accountability is a subset of restorative justice, because people demand accountability in some form or another. So to me, that gives me great optimism for the future.
My take on this is one of optimism, and I think, you know, we all have to understand that we are in this for the long game. We are in a phase now that is not where we wish to be. But if you look at what's happening from a historical, take a step back, you know, from Nuremberg, nothing really happened until 1993, when there was an ICTY created. And within a few years after that, there were people like Brenda, and Fabrizio, and myself. David, I remember meeting when David first entered the scene, scratching our heads in The Hague, trying to figure out what are the essential elements of half of the crimes we're proving in this indictment that's been charged. Because there was so much about the law that the lawyers didn't know. I was a trial lawyer. You know, the Geneva Conventions to me were like, what? We had to prove the existence of an international conflict. Why? Well, because we have to prove that the grave breaches regime applies to these crimes. There was so much law that we were clueless about, and we were trying cases from beginning to end over the course of years and months, not knowing in the end what the judges would actually decide the elements were that we had to prove, and therefore whether we had proved them.
You should have seen the fights.
And there was big fights between the IHL people, like Fletcher, and
You're tarred with that brush.
anyway, so we went from Nuremberg to nothing until that in the early 1990s. And now 25 years later, the law is not very much in dispute. There are disagreements, and lawyers can come up with arguments on the contours of most of this. But the law is so well developed, and procedures and practices for doing these cases now are so well developed. And it's my hope that the law and the practice and all we've learned will find a way to move forward, whether those cases are being prosecuted at the ICC, or in a hybrid court, or in a German court. And I thought that the snapshot that Ambassador Rapp gave us today about what's happening in all of these other areas was really optimistic, or it made me feel very optimistic, because I wasn't aware of all of that. But certainly, it's taking some time, but we're all adjusting, and we're in it for the long game. And we will be able to turn this around, because the politicians come and go. But in the end, you know, the demand for accountability and justice is the thing that stays with us, and it's given rise to all this. And that's not.
Could I just give an example about the evolution of the law? Because, as you just heard, our first litigated case since Nuremberg was really the Tadich case. And so that was the first time that the Office of the Prosecutor and the defense were able to tell the judges, here's what we think the elements are. And we as the prosecution were very interested in what the judges thought, because we had to prove our case beyond a reasonable doubt. So we filed our pretrial brief with what we thought the elements of all these offenses were, including the offenses we actually had jurisdiction over, the contextual elements, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and the definitions. So we gave our written brief, the defense gave their written brief, we had oral arguments, and then we waited for the judges to tell us, as the prosecution, what we had to prove. And we waited, and we waited, and the trial was about to begin, and so we said, can we have a status conference with you? And they said, sure. So we went into the status conference, and we said, well, Your Honors, what are the elements of these offenses so we know what we have to prove? And they said, we'll tell you those elements when we deliver our judgment. But, prosecution, if we were you, we'd prove what you think the elements are, and we'd also prove what the defense thinks the elements are. So for some of our early cases, that's exactly the situation we found ourselves in. We didn't really quite know exactly how they were going to interpret what we had to prove. So not only did we have to put forward what we thought we had to prove, but we had to kind of guess how they may differ and try to prove that as well. So it was an interesting time, as you might say.
Well, we looking back 25 years now, it is 25 years now, 93 and 98, we have jurisprudence. We have proven rules of procedure and evidence. And we've got now deep experience in doing this. That's huge. That just in and of itself, from the idea that we're going to hold heads of state accountable starting in 1993 all the way to here, at the end of the day, we can do this. That's really, it's difficult to do, but it's not the hard part. The hard part is getting the politicians and the diplomats to decide we're going to do it. Once they, cock the rifle, we're ready. Just give us the mandate and we're off and running because of this vast experience now that we've had over these 25 years. And that's where you're going to fit in.
Totally. But the question is, and I think we should hear your questions now, but I think the important thing is, when I was doing my law studies, if anyone had told me, when you grow up, you're going to be an international prosecutor, what is an international prosecutor? Now there is a career, but basically you have people that retire doing war crimes work.
When I was in law school, we had one course on international law. It's called Public International Law, taught by an old gentleman who spoke Latin most of the time, and the book was like that thick, and it was like going through, catechism. It was, no one cared. It's like, why is this important?
I realized that the common law lawyers seem to have this profound aversion to Latin. Have you realized that? But anyway, I think we should answer questions, really.
So we heard a lot this afternoon about holding those who committed torture following post 9/11, holding those people accountable. And obviously that's very hard to do given the current state of impunity for those kinds of crimes in the United States. So my question for, I guess, all of you is, do you see a future in which those individuals, those American individuals, are held accountable? And if so, what is that accountability look like?
No, not even maybe, but no, there will be no accountability for any of the acts that took place in the United States between 2002 to 2009. In fact, I've got this slide, and I used to teach at Syracuse. It showed President Charles Taylor saying, we need to just take and look at all of these situations and just move on so we can have peace. And I have also the exact same quote by President Obama doing the same thing when he decided that he's not going to go backwards and hold accountable individuals who, this is just the tip of the iceberg. He testified before the commission I was on, and he actually told the real story, and it brought the audience to tears. It was so horrific. There will be no accountability. It's a decision by United States government that we're just going to move on. So, I just have to tell you, in my opinion, it's a considered judgment. There will be no accountability. The American people.
That's politically preferable to allow the ICC to open an investigation into at least the portion of the detention of the rendition program that is linked to the Afghanistan situation than to do something internally, which would have basically trumped the ICC's exercise of jurisdiction. Now, what's going to happen if and when we get authorization from the pretrial chamber to open the investigation in Afghanistan, and if and when the Office of the Prosecutor considers that this is a case worth prioritizing in relation to other clusters of victimization within the Afghanistan situation, is hard to predict. We know one thing: we will not get cooperation from the U.S. authorities. That much is clear. But we already have some expertise in the context of investigations against, the state's interest and against and going forward without really getting cooperation from states. There's a lot of people that may be willing to give us information. Now, what is that? What type of dynamic that is going to trigger? Difficult to predict. I mean, it could happen in a situation where the U.S. criminalizes any cooperation with the ICC in the context of an Afghanistan situation, which would put anyone that wishes to testify in a hypothetical case in a situation of peril. Hopefully that won't happen, but you know, it's difficult to predict. I mean, I think that, but the possibility of some sort of international initiative, even if it gets to the point of only the issue of an international warrant of arrest that you will never get executed because the U.S. will never execute it, well, that's a form of accountability, right? At least you get some historical record, you get something there, you have some judges saying, well, there are reasonable grounds to believe that all this happened. And you get that. There is some interesting accountability light coming from the European Court of Human Rights cases. I mean, you have seen at least two, Guantanamo detainees, Abusadera, and I can't remember the name of the other one, have brought cases via human rights lawyers that have international practices or human rights NGOs that are bringing these cases forward, and that has led to very successful results in the cases against Poland and Lithuania for the cooperation in relation to the cases. So there is some accountability. I mean, there is perhaps it will never reach what we would like to see. But at times, this is what happens with justice in these type of situations. You get the accountability that you can, not the accountability that you would want to have.
I think also in the U.S. context, if there's to be any relief at all, it would be in the form of civil actions through the courts. But when you look at the kind of people that are being appointed as judges, I find that fairly bleak as well, because I think they'd be very sympathetic to the U.S. government coming in and saying you have to bar this action and national security, all of that. So I think for the time being, it's bleak. I do think internationally, however, again, going back to universal jurisdiction, or even if a citizen of a country says, I was subjected to this, and we happen to have an official traveling through that country, then I think there can be some action. You know, Pinochet found to his chagrin that if you travel outside your country, you may find yourself being held accountable for things you did in your country.
Well, you know, the interesting thing, if you do, and you actually open an investigation and you begin to move towards an appropriate result, whatever that may be, you know, there are a lot of senior people in the United States government right now, including the director of the CIA, who was in charge of this whole thing. She better stop traveling.
Yeah.
I mean, if I was your general counsel, I'd say, you know, I wouldn't take that vacation in, you know, on the coast of France or what have you, or just travel officially. How embarrassing would it be is, let's say she shows up in Poland, and, you know, state party, investigation going on, she is a target. I mean, she is, you know, I would love to help you prosecute her, but the point is that if just the fact that the ICC would open something, it would automatically force the American people to say, wait a minute, what's going on here? And even that is better than just letting time and history go.
Yeah. Now, the interesting thing with this, and I think it's the last thing that I'm going to say, is that there seems to also be a divide between public opinion in the U.S. and these policies of impunity, effectively. Because then, when we were surprised to see when we requested the opening of investigations, to say actually there was a majority of public opinion saying, no, there should be some form of accountability. And I think it's because you guys have deeply ingrained, and I've learned that from working with American prosecutors, like those that I have surrounded me, you have a deep sense of what's right and what's wrong. And you don't want to see wrongs remaining unaddressed, and that's almost intuitive for you. I mean, so I wasn't surprised to see that result at the end. I say, no, I think actually, yeah, they would want some accountability, whatever that is, even if it leads to reduced sentences because people were acting under wrong instructions and they didn't understand what was happening, whatever. But you would like to see something. So it's a bit of a shame that, you know, this is also colliding against a wall of impunity. That seems to be what's happened.
And even the declassified version of summary of the Senate report, I mean, you rightly say we will never know the exact truth, but it gets you closer to the truth if you put that together with European Court of Human Rights judgment you were referring to and a few other things. You get a sense.
So, thank you for this all.
You need to yell.
I will yell. Thank you
I
for
flew
being
for
here,
20
is what I
hours,
said.
my ears are clogged, I won't hear that.
Okay, I don't know where the handheld mic is.
So, my question is about technology and how it might be used as evidence in the future, especially with the last panel's theme of how victims and civilians that go through these horrible atrocities, there's now technological developments that may allow them to capture content which proves what they're going through. I know we've all seen stuff, especially with Syria, the Arab Spring. We all remember like Coney 2012, and it all seems to go viral and then disappear. But I was wondering if, I guess for all of you, if you think that it might have an actual impact someday, even in a tribunal, if they can like have proof.
Yeah, no, it is the latest trend, right? I mean, it's, in terms of how these things, I mean, you may know that we, last year, we issued a warrant of arrest against one of the Libyan's national army that, contrary to its name, it's not an army, it's a militia group, Al-Warfali, for summary execution of civilians in the context of Syria. And that was an investigation entirely based on cyber evidence and social media evidence. So this group had posted in Facebook the execution of the civilians, and we managed to download the stuff from Facebook and engage in whole process of analysis of the images, of the footage, identifying the location, so doing geolocation of the different places where the crimes have occurred, identifying the actors, the people that were in the video, identifying the victims and tracking back the victims or relatives. So we did a full war crimes investigation without moving from The Hague, and it was in that sense very revolutionary. So the exploitation of what is called user content is becoming more and more relevant. There are limitations to that, obviously. I mean, I think that in some cases what's happening is that some first responders that are providing people with software, with apps that they can download and use in the mobile phones, and those apps, what they do is they put some sort of electronic seal stamp on your footage, so that gives all the metadata you need to make sure you can show a court, say, look, I mean, this was taken on this date, this location, and it can be tampered with because of this software that has been used in this particular manner.
They're using that for recording encounters with police.
Yeah, well, exactly.
In this country.
Yeah.
But also the IBA has a program, a portal that you can
Yes,
download, and
that's
it
right.
gives.
That's one of them.
And because the real issue, I think that's the future. I think we'll use it more. The real issue is what I am seeing here. Is it what it purports to be? How reliable is it? And what's the credibility of the source? And so what we see is not always accurate, because it may have been tampered with. It may have been just a partial view, and then there was something that would have been exonerating or something else that wasn't captured. So its evidentiary value is open to those kinds of challenges, but I think there'll be more of that use in the future. And in fact, Berkeley is working on a protocol for the collection, preservation, and use of open source evidence. As far back as the Rwanda genocide, we had photojournalists that were actually a distance from checkpoints. And so they were photographing, they were doing videos of people coming to a checkpoint, being stopped at the checkpoint. You could see the faces of the victims, you could see the faces, the uniforms of the people at the checkpoint. You could see them looking at the ID cards, and then you could see them taking some people over here and using machetes to kill them. So, and we had the photojournalists, so we could have them come in and talk about what they showed. So the potential for this has always been there, but even today with all these advances, it's even greater potential for that, as long as we can overcome these admissibility issues.
The Singapore, they have the converse side of the developments in technology is the developments in rogue technology, right? So the use of fake reality, where you can basically recreate digitally a situation that never existed, and present that as, you know, footage of, you know, David Crane killing Doc Stringer tonight because he was late for this meeting. So I actually did that digitally in my house using just basically taking the images from both of them and inserted them in a video creation. So that happens. That is on the rise also in terms of development, and it's something that we, for instance, trying to engage with Carnegie Mellon and other Berkeley and other institutions to say, okay, how can we develop systems that are going to be able to detect that type of fake evidence and weed it out?
STL.
Yeah.
The Special Tribunal for Lebanon, the case
That's right.
we're having
That's right.
is built on telephone intercepts, cell phone intercepts. And so it's very, very technical in terms of the stations to identify where the locations were from one cell phone to another, being able to identify users for those cell phones. But it's very, very technical in its presentation, and virtually their entire case is built on that.
It's on the different networks, different
Yeah.
locations. But one important development is interesting is we're having now a discussion with with Facebook and YouTube, because there's a tension between what they want to do, which is to delete these videos as soon as possible, and our interest in having those videos preserved. So we have to engage in a whole discussion with both of them. So listen, when you destroy a video of a fundamentalist group killing civilians in Mali, you are destroying evidence of a war crime case that we can put together. So please don't do it. And so it's okay, what do we do? Because obviously nobody wants to be seen as destroying evidence. So now there's a possibility of creating staging repositories where they can put some of the stuff that becomes available to us and to other mechanisms. But it's also an important conversation that had to be had, because at one point they were really deleted in mass and we went, stop!
Let's be clear,
Yep.
there's a practical, huge problem here. And I'll just use Syria as a context. Part of the Syrian Accountability Project, we started at the very beginning of the conflict and began gathering and building a conflict map and a crime-based matrix on verifiable incidents. We had to have at least 2 verifications before we entered it into the crime-based matrix. And all of this stuff, and let me underscore, stuff coming out of Syria is in the petabytes, which is 1 million terabytes, which is 1 million megabytes. So that number is, I don't understand the number, I'm just explaining it. The point is that now, for those of us who have been in the business a long time, when we first started to investigate, we investigated and we sent investigators out and gathered the evidence. Now, this evidence is coming in. It's a needle in a haystack, because the rules of procedure and evidence have not changed. The same things that you're learning in evidence class in your particular university is the same that we're held to here. And so it gives a false sense of security. And the challenge that I had working with the UN when we began to think about the IIIM, which I call the Syrian Accountability Center, so it kind of morphed a little bit. But the point is I became concerned that the UN had a false sense that we got him. And the answer is I was working with a group of nations, because nothing else was being done in the UN about Syria over many years. We had an informal kind of group of people, 15 permanent reps and a couple of us, just talking about Syria and doing it. I just got frustrated one day, and I said, look, you have to understand, as a chief prosecutor, I can't put any of this in evidence. I can't authenticate it. I can't show its reliability. I can't show its relevance. I've just got lots of great historical data. And so we're going to have to start taking, with all these NGOs gathering good and very bad evidence, and then the new wrinkle with fake evidence, which goes directly to reliability, it's going to cause us problems. So I said, the only real evidence we have that Assad has committed war crimes and crimes against humanity that we have in our possession that he can't deal with is the stuff that Caesar pulled out in the high definition photos back in 2014. We've got the guy who took the picture. We got the guy who signed the paperwork with the photograph. We got the guy who put the magic marker on the dead body. So I can bring Caesar in and he can say, yeah, I took that picture on that date at this particular time and that showed this particular individual, and I'm going to get that into evidence. But there's not much more. I mean, I'm being a little bit general, but at the end of the day, so we had to have the United Nations admit that and then start professionalizing this data, which is now what the mechanism is doing, is taking all of this and turning it into someday over time where we can be confident that we have at a minimum what we call criminal information that can be either developed into evidence, or we actually start having authenticated, relevant evidence that we can in confidence now hand to a local, regional, or international prosecutor someday.
But even then, if you get that, if you are able to develop that body of data into admissible evidence, 99% of the time, it's going to be evidence proving that a crime occurred. It's not, in all likelihood, going to be something that is going to be evidence that you can use to link that crime to the person you're prosecuting, particularly if the person you're prosecuting is a head of state or is the chief of staff of the Army, someone who was far removed from the evidence of the crimes. And one thing that doesn't change in this, that's always been the case, is that proving that the crime occurred, it's not so hard. Whether you're doing it the old-fashioned way by sending an investigator out into the field, or sending the investigator into Turkey or to Jordan or elsewhere to speak to the victims, to get the witness statements, whether it's images that come, that's great. But in the end, a prosecutor is going to be on his or her feet somewhere in a courtroom, trying to articulate beyond a reasonable doubt why these horrendous things you're seeing in these images, or these horrendous things that the witnesses are telling you about happened in the camp or in the detention center. Why the head of state is responsible for that. What's your evidence? What's your legal theory? And that is where the hard work is in these cases. And all the technology in the world isn't going to get you there.
So it's a curse and a help. And I don't know where this is all going, to be honest with you, because we don't understand. The courts, law is always long behind technology. And the jurisprudence is not going to help us get to that gap. So, we're still looking for a needle in a haystack in some instances.
Just to add a word on examples of use of videos as evidence in cases concerning Syria, you may want to look at what Sweden has done in a number of cases. You have a recent report of Human Rights Watch that is actually showing how Germany on one hand and Sweden have been dealing with cases, and Sweden has been using extensively videos of execution, and a bit like the case you described in the case of Libya. One way, totally agree with you, David, of the volumes that we are talking about, and that actually shapes the type of responses that you put in place to deal with that. So now we're thinking how to filter the volumes, how to go through the huge amounts and use maybe logarithm to actually dig through the volume and go to what will become a sizable, usable range of videos that you can use, answering the questions of admissibility that Brenda raised in terms of why did you choose this instead of this, why did you go for a short version, deduplicating, authentifying. So just to give you an example, if I compare the type of resources that the ICTY put together originally in terms of IT experts and equipment in its structure and what I have to put together for the AAAM, I have a team which in half is composed of e-discovery people, technicians, and we're looking at partnership to work on how to deal with this issue of the audiovisual materials. And that's really not just an help or a classic IT support to your core activity. It's actually part of the core activity. It's really conceived as an integral part of the work in order to address that. But Doug is totally right. I mean, if you are dealing with physical perpetrators, this kind of material is going to be extremely useful. If you're dealing with other types of crime, including attacks and demonstrating that certain attacks occurred in a particular way, you of course have the linkage, which is a key aspect of all the cases. As soon as you go higher up, you have to
Yeah, I
work, not just on
I
crime
think it
based.
can help you though. I mean, I agree with Doug to a point. I think that, for instance, the joint investigation done for the gunning of the MH17, the Malaysia Airlines flight over Ukraine, that was a cyber investigation. It was a big investigation. It was an investigation, and it allowed to establish a link to the provenance of the missile, how it had come, and to track it all the way back to Russia, which initially the attribution was completely unclear. And there were multiple. So without that investigation, you could have even started the linkage. Because at least on that one, you know where it came from, you can start doing the connection. So it can help when there's no one knows which unit entered a village. Well, that can happen, you know, to have
Same with the chemical attacks events in Syria. You start with a crime base. If you look at what the OPCW FFM has done, it's been looking at use of chemicals. Then you have to go a step further, which is mechanism to attribute responsibility to certain entity, and then you go into what we are dealing with, which is the individual criminal responsibility, and going beyond the entity, of course using different standards anyway.
So the media can help you. The media can help you with that. Yeah, the media can help you with that because for some of the forms of liability for higher level people, knowledge is important. And so if this is notorious, if there have been international, for example, UN reports that have been distributed to the leadership, then you can begin to, at least one part of the proof you can do that way. But it's typically only one part of the proof.
I'm so sorry, we are out of time, I believe. I've been asked to bring us to a close. But this has been a fantastic session, and thank you so much for your time. As always,